Mr. DeGuerin, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I want to begin by talking about your background a bit. Why law? Why criminal law?
Well, it's more exciting than any other kind of law, frankly. And the first real job I got out of law school was with the district attorney's office in Houston. As I just loved what I was doing. It was dealing with people every day instead of documents and wills or estates or corporations or insurance and things like that. Plus, I was dealing with cops and basically playing cops and robbers. And I was on the good side. And I got to ride along with police officers. I was 23 or 24 years old and getting to ride in a cop car and being able to leave whenever I wanted to instead of being taken to jail was something that was a lot of fun, very exciting. I got in some real exciting scrapes, and I got to learn all the challenges that law enforcement people on the front lines face, which helped me be, I believe, a better prosecutor, because it was more than just a report in black and white about what had happened. It was seeing it for myself, and seeing the dangers and the challenges. So you ask why criminal law? I got interested at the very beginning, and I'd always had an interest in trials and being a trial lawyer. And getting with the district attorney's office put me in the courtroom immediately. Whereas if I had been in with some big law firm, it would have taken years to get into a courtroom, and then only to determine who entered the intersection first or something like that, something not very meaningful.
Your old boss, Percy Foreman, made a career of representing, let's say, unpopular people. How important is it for defense lawyers to zealously advocate for those people that society will deem undesirable, let's say?
Well, it's what we're supposed to do. That's the first thing. If they're not lawyers that are willing to take the tough cases and the ones that represent the people that society looks down upon, then that you don't get fair trials. You don't get a fair result. You can't rely on the results of trials if you don't have reasonably equal advocates on both sides of the question. So as far as representing people in criminal cases, the general public usually believes that someone that's arrested and charged with a crime is guilty. And that's not always the case. In fact, it's frequently not the case. And it's also frequently the case that the authorities overcharge or charge much more serious crimes than what really occurred, or that there's problems with the evidence, problems with the testimony. There's all sorts of things that can be wrong with a criminal accusation. And it's the job of the lawyer to advocate for the client, not to be judgmental about the client, but to be the client's advocate. The person is entitled to someone that's on his side. And that's what a criminal defense lawyer, that's his sworn duty.
Is trial work natural? In other words, does it have to come naturally, or can it be taught over time, or is it some combination of both?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. It's come naturally for me. I like people. I like dealing with people. I like the prospect of convincing people that what I say is correct. And that's part of what trial work is. It's presenting the most believable alternative fact, because a trial is a measuring of alternative facts, those alleged by the prosecution and those alleged by the defense. Sometimes, in fact, probably the majority of times, it's a question of challenging what the state says rather than presenting an affirmative view of the facts. Of course, by challenging what the state says, you are in effect presenting an alternative view of the facts. So I like the challenge. It has come naturally to me, but I try to teach that advocacy in the classes that I've taught for 25 years at law school at the University of Texas. So if I'm endeavoring to teach it, I must think that it's a skill that can be taught. I don't know if that's much of an answer to, is it natural or can it be taught? But maybe it's a combination of both.
I want to talk about some of your cases, and I want to begin by talking about Waco. How did you get involved in representing David Koresh?
I can give you the short story or the long story. The long story is that I had just been involved in a criminal case, a capital murder case that had originated in Waco. It was very notorious. It was called the Lake Waco murders, 3 teenagers who were murdered brutally. And the client that I represented had been convicted on his first trial. I didn't represent him. He had appealed the case on his own and gotten a reversal. And he hired me, and I went to trial. We moved the case to Fort Worth. We tried the case in Fort Worth, and it was televised the whole trial from gavel to gavel in Waco. So I was, for a few months, very well known in Waco. That was in December of 1992. Well, the raid on the Branch Davidian compound was February the 28th, 1993, just 2 months later. So most of the Davidians knew who I was. And there were a lot of lawyers that were trying to get involved in that case because it was a huge case. You know, it was a terrible abuse by the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people. I'd had plenty of experience with them. So that kind of sets the stage. And I got a call from Bonnie Haldeman, who was David Koresh's mother. And she asked me if I'd be interested in representing him. And she didn't know what to do. That's the kind of call that defense lawyers often get. They frequently get a call from a mother or a father or a loved one of some sort of a person who is suspected of or accused of a crime and has not been actually brought into custody yet. What do I do? Well, the only thing that a lawyer can advise, of course, is we have to get you in custody if there's a warrant out for your arrest. So anyway, she engaged me. And I wanted to be sure that I wasn't one of those lawyers that was soliciting the case. So I asked her to meet me in Waco with her in the car. I wanted her to be my credentials. And so that the FBI or whoever was making the decision on who would be allowed to talk to Koresh would know that I came from authority from his mother. So that's how I got involved. And of course, the FBI didn't want to let anybody talk to him. And I had trouble getting in contact with him myself because all outside contact had been cut off by the FBI after the ATF raid. But eventually they saw the benefit of having being able to talk to someone that Koresh and the Davidians trusted. That would be me as their representative. So that's what I did.
How did the siege at Mount Carmel get so out of hand?
Well, basically it was a fuck up by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the bureau about which a congressman said they're just nothing but jackbooted thugs. I'd had unpleasant experiences with them as a defense lawyer in the past. So when I heard about the case, long before I was contacted, when I heard about the case on the evening of February the 28th, I figured, well, ATF is bound to have screwed it up in some way. And when I started looking at the facts, the little facts that were known, which were by that time only the facts that the FBI was letting out, I could see that it was a raid that was poorly planned, poorly executed, and that the Davidians, who would be accused of killing the agents that were killed, probably had a self-defense case to be made. And the deeper I got into it, the more convinced I became of that. But to answer your question directly, the ATF screwed it up. And then the FBI came in that afternoon, the afternoon of the 28th, and pushed the ATF aside and took over the scene, surrounded the place, and basically besieged it in the strictest definition of what a siege is. And siege is a form of warfare and has been since the earliest times. Basically cut off all communication and supplies to the Davidians, which is the definition of a siege. You know, you look back in history, one of the most famous sieges in history was the siege at Constantinople. And another, of course, that's more familiar to Texans in our history is the siege of the Alamo. So I knew that's what was going to happen, and there had to be some way to break that siege.
How tough was it when the FBI ultimately told you you're not needed anymore, implying that the end was near, not only for Koresh, but others in the compound?
I thought we had a solution. I thought that I had a plan worked out where Koresh would surrender with, I would go in and he would walk out with me and surrender to a Texas Ranger. Now there's an old apocryphal tale in Texas about how back around the turn of the previous century, in 1900, there was a riot in far north Texas. The Texas Rangers are known as a statewide, very elite police agency, and they've been known as such since the beginning of Texas history as a first a nation and then a state. And so the story goes that the sheriff of this small town in North Texas, where there was this riot going on, telegraphed the governor in Austin and said, "Governor, we've got a riot going on up here. Send the Rangers." And the governor telegraphed back, "Okay." And the next train arrives. The sheriff's there to meet the train, and off the train steps one captain of Texas Rangers, one ranger. And the sheriff says, "What? You're only one ranger?" And he said, "Well, you only got one riot." And so it's kind of ingrained in anybody that's grown up in Texas that the Rangers are who to deal with and tough to deal with. I thought that because Koresh and the other Davidians distrusted and had every reason to distrust federal law enforcement, that they would see the value and the public relations value, in fact, in having Koresh surrender to one Texas Ranger. And so that was my solution to it. I proposed that to the Rangers that I was dealing with. And they said, "We'll do that, but you got to get the FBI to approve it." I went to the FBI agents in charge that I was dealing with, who had allowed me to go into the compound on 5 different days and propose that. They said, "Well, if that'll work, we'll do it." They didn't seem to be too happy about it because it was in essence turning over their investigation to the Rangers, but they'd already decided to do that as far as the investigation into the murder of the agents on February the 28th. So that's what was going to happen. The next time I went to Waco, and it was going to take a week or so. Koresh said that he was in the middle of writing his interpretation of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation, and he wanted to get that done before he surrendered. And as soon as he got that done, he would come out with me. And I told the FBI that. They muttered under their breath and said, "Well, we'll wait. We can take all the time we need." I didn't know that at that very moment they were planning with Janet Reno a tank and tear gas assault. So I left Waco and I went on about my business, waiting to get the call that Koresh was ready to come out, having finished the 7 seals. And the next call I got was from my wife on the morning of the 19th saying, "Turn on the television." I did, and I saw that the tanks were poking holes in the building and inserting tear gas, and so I called the FBI. And I reached the special agent in charge I'd been dealing with, Bob Ricks, and said, "I can see that this is it. This is you've lost your patience. I'll come down there and go back in and bring him out." He said, "You don't need to. We don't need you anymore." I went down there anyway, but by the time I got there, the place had burned to the ground. I was about to start a trial in North Texas, in Denton, Texas, for North Texas, and it took me basically a half a day to get out of that trial, go back to my hotel, pack up, and come back down to Waco. And I got there about noon, and it was gone.
What impact do you think Waco, perhaps in conjunction with Ruby Ridge, had an impact on the way the American public viewed government power?
I think it was a wake-up call. Maybe not everyone, maybe not even a majority of people, but it was certainly something that was a government fiasco, a law enforcement fiasco. And what it illustrated, certainly for me and for others, lawyers that had been dealing in this, but what for people that really looked at it was the awesome power of law enforcement. I mean, this was supposed to be a civilian law enforcement effort to arrest and bring charges against David Koresh originally for possession of illegal weapons. At the time, it was a minor federal felony, and yet everyone in the compound, only a few people had anything to do with the guns. Everyone in the compound was treated the same way. That is, by a virtual army of heavily armed law enforcement people descending on their home, and a firefight started. At the same time, the law enforcement people that were investigating had no idea of what the beliefs of these people were. They had very strongly held beliefs that the end of the world was coming and that they were going to be attacked by forces of evil from the outside, and they were preparing to defend themselves in that attack. As I said, there were very few of those inside that were involved in the gun business, but they were all, or most of them were prepared to defend themselves in Texas as well as most states. In fact, in most countries, the human right of self-defense is recognized in the law in various ways, but the law in Texas, as well as elsewhere, is that you do not have the right to resist a lawful arrest. And that's pretty clear. But you have the right to defend yourself against excessive force. And those two rights sometimes come into conflict. If a law enforcement officer has a legal warrant and yet tries to execute that warrant using excessive force, then you have a right to resist that. And if the excessive force is deadly force, as it was here, then you have the right to resist it with deadly force. And that was the defense that I saw from the very beginning. And in fact, jump forward 2 years later to the trials of the survivors who were all charged with murder and a conspiracy to murder. The jury in San Antonio, Texas, acquitted all of them, found them all not guilty on that basis. Self-defense. You ask whether it had an effect on the public. I hope so. I think that it changed a lot of approaches that the FBI has taken since then. And it certainly caused a giant shakeup in the ATF Bureau. And I think they're much more cautious and careful of the use of excessive force nowadays.
I want to talk about your representation of Robert Durst. Were you surprised when Durst was charged with the murder of Susan Berman?
I was. I say surprised. I didn't think that he would be, because I had evaluated that case on what was known to me 10 years earlier. I tried the first murder case he was charged with, and we got our verdict in 2003. It happened in 2001. And in preparing for that case, of course, I became aware of the disappearance of his wife, for one thing, and the murder of Susan Berman in California, for another thing. But I looked at the evidence that was known at that time and didn't think there was any evidence that he was responsible for either one. And in fact, got the judge in Galveston, Texas to rule that the prosecution couldn't bring evidence forward of that, either one of those cases. But then, like a lot of people in the country, I watched the 6-part series, The Jinx. In fact, I had been interviewed for it a year or two before it came out. I recommended that Bob not be interviewed for it. He didn't take my recommendation. All of his lawyers said he shouldn't interview for it, but he insisted. And of course, it wasn't a documentary. It was an effort to get him to entrap himself. And so by the time the 6th segment was about to come out, I knew that they were going to charge him. In fact, before the 6th segment, I talked to him the week before. And I had a plan. I wanted to take him out to LA and surrender him so that he could perhaps make bond and show to the prosecutors there that he was not going to run. But unfortunately, he again didn't take my advice, and he ran and was caught in New Orleans the day before the airing of the 6th segment.
Was the fact that he was better known, or so much better known, by the time that second trial came around, did that make it more difficult to represent him? How did that complicate the case?
Yeah, it did complicate the case. Of course, the trial in Galveston, the general public didn't see the evidence and wasn't at the trial, and so didn't see what we saw and what we presented. And it was a shock to the general public that he was acquitted. So it got a tremendous amount of not only statewide, but nationwide publicity about that. So he became a very well-known person as a result of it. Although he was well-known and his family was well-known in New York before that. It made it much more difficult because there were so many people that thought that he should have been convicted and thought that he had escaped justice. And therefore they were willing to believe that he was guilty of whatever they were going to charge him with. And it brought people out of the woodwork to testify about him who really had no direct knowledge of anything. And then COVID hit right during the middle of the beginning of the trial and made everything even more difficult, because when we came back after COVID, of course, isn't over yet, but when we came back, the jurors were all wearing masks. The witnesses were wearing masks. The lawyers, the judge, everybody in the courtroom was behind a mask, and it just was not a fair trial. And by that time, he'd had a lot of health problems. He was very sick. He should not have been tried because he was not able to defend himself. He was just not there. It was like there was a guy on his deathbed sitting next to me in the courtroom. It was pretty difficult.
Did you expect a conviction in that case?
Well, after all the difficulties that we had in selecting a jury in the first place, in trying the case, half of the case was tried with depositions that were recorded. In other words, it was tried by television. And with his inability to be of assistance, the longer it went on that way, the more worried I became about the outcome. And frankly, I still had hopes at the very end. I guess you have to keep on fighting. But I was not surprised at the verdict.
Mr. DeGuerin, I'll let you go on this. Why are good criminal defense lawyers important?
The power of the state, the power of law enforcement, the power of the government is so overwhelming that when the government chooses, and by the government I mean state, federal, local, chooses to accuse someone of commission of a crime, chooses to take away their liberty, under our system, which is an adversary system, an accusatory system, every person is entitled to defend themselves. And of course, lay people cannot be expected, even lawyers couldn't be expected to defend themselves without outside help. And so from the earliest times, we've recognized, and we got this from the British system of law and from the common law, lawyers have been advocates for their clients, to advocate the rules of evidence, the rules of procedure, the constitutional rights of individuals, and the criminal laws. It's very important that someone that is conversant with and knows all those rules and regulation stand by the side of someone that's accused. Otherwise, we would have trial by affidavit, trial by inquisition, and it would become the person who's accused responsibility to prove their innocence. That's so contrary to our system of justice as to be abhorrent to me. So it's important to have lawyers to advocate, to stand up for someone.
Mr. DeGuerin, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for talking about your career, your background, your views. It's very much appreciated.
You're welcome.